So for those who don't know me, I'm Kristen Turnbull and I'm a director at CoreData WA. So as Anthony mentioned, today I'm going to be taking you through what's a very high level view of an extensive research report. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but if you are interested to know more after the session, as Anthony mentioned, the full report will be available and we'll give you the details on how to access that a little bit later. So just to kind of, I guess, expand on the background that Anthony just gave, we were really interested with this research in looking beyond salary and really looking at the broader employee value proposition that companies are offering to kind of give you some insight into how you can differentiate what you're offering to your current staff, but also how you can better attract new talent as well. So we really wanted to look at what are those additional financial benefits beyond salary and the non-financial benefits that are going to really make a difference for your staff in terms of their experience and their satisfaction, and help you essentially appeal to more people as well. So we did this via an online survey. So the survey was in field. We started in December and we went right through to February, really trying to canvass the views of many people in the sector as we could. And obviously we did see some changes during COVID that necessitated quick responses from companies. But a lot of what we found here, we believe, are really long-term trends and will actually help provide you with some insights into how to navigate the way forward as we move into the next phase and move out of COVID-19. So in terms of the sample, we had 345 respondents across the WA mining sector, so quite a robust sample of people that responded, and that included 55 partners of people working in the sector. And we think that's quite a unique perspective that we've brought the partnering angle into this, and we'll go into why we think that's important as we move through the presentation. So the first insight that I wanted to share with you is really around the importance of making staff aware of what you're actually offering. Obviously, people can't value something they're not aware of or don't understand. And what we did find is that when we asked people to rate their understanding of the various benefits that are available to them, while you can see on this chart that we did have 2/3 of workers saying that they had a good understanding of their leave and travel benefits, that drops down to around half when we look at additional financial benefits and non-financial benefits. So what do we mean by that? Additional financial benefits, we looked at things like additional contributions to super, we looked at productivity bonuses, profit share, shares, those sorts of things. And then non-financial benefits is more around wellness and mental health, as well as training that companies can offer to their staff as well. So we will look at some of those in a bit more detail in just a moment. But I think that's the first thing to take away here, is that there's a real need for better education in the sector about what benefits are actually available, because that could actually help you to differentiate outside of salary. So we're going to be talking about 3 key themes today, and the first one that I wanted to talk through with you is this focus on work-life balance. And we do hear a lot about work-life balance in this sector, but we really wanted to look at what does that look like from a benefit perspective, and how can you actually aid that work-life balance when people are on site in particular. So we think that especially after the extended rosters that we saw during COVID-19, it's really important to understand, what is it that people are looking for when it comes to that balance. So the first aspect we looked at were the importance of non-financial benefits. So we looked at a whole range of non-financial benefits, and there is, if you get the full report, you will see the importance of all the benefits that we canvass people's views on. But what we've done here is just highlight a couple for you that we think are really important and warrant some further discussion. And those are even time rosters and roster choice or flexibility. Now, one of the things we looked at was not just how important these benefits were to people, but also the extent to which they're available or being made available to staff. And we looked at the, in the orange there, you can see what we've called the availability gap. And we think this is important because this shows essentially the disconnect between what the workforce is telling us is important to them and what companies are actually doing. So you can see here that 3/4 of workers are telling us that even time rosters are an important non-financial benefit, yet only just over a third of companies are actually making this available to their FIFO workers. Again, with roster choice, important to around 7 in 10, but only available at around 1 in 5 employers. Again, this is the employee perspective or the worker perspective. So it's possible, given the first insight I just talked about around the lack of understanding, that in some cases there are benefits that people actually aren't aware of that are available. So that talks to communication issue. But if your company is not offering them, then I guess this does suggest that these are really important drivers to consider in terms of what workers are telling us is important. We also then looked at the top 3 non-financial benefits that would actually drive them to switch or would have kept them with their previous employer where they have chosen to leave. So we took the perspective of both the current workers as well as former workers, and we thought it was important to include people who've left the industry because this gives us a view of what might have kept them in the industry. So how could we have maybe changed the things we're offering or the way we're communicating the benefits to actually get that retention of those workers? So from a current worker perspective, you can see here that for even time rosters, you've got around 2 in 5 current workers saying that this is one of the top 3 non-financial benefits that would either keep them or encourage them to switch. And you've got around 3 in 10 saying that the option to choose or change their roster would be a top 3 driver. And you've got fairly similar numbers, but slightly lower for those former workers. So those are really coming through as being key things for you to be offering to your workforce. We also looked at leave and travel benefits. Again, we looked at a whole range of different benefits here, but we've just highlighted a couple. So a couple that came through as highly sought out by workers were travel on company time. So the ability to have that travel time as paid time. So that was important to around 8 in 10 workers. Yet we're seeing less than half of companies actually offering this. And then roster days off as well. So around 6 in 10 telling us that this is important to them, but less than a third offering rostered days off to their staff. So an availability gap in both of those areas as well. Interestingly, when we looked though at the top 3 drivers, we actually found that travel on company time was a far more significant driver of what would make people stay or leave than RDOs. So you might consider that while RDOs are important, they're perhaps more of a nice to have than the travel on company time, which is being considered, a key driver for both current and former workers, with around 3/4 of current workers telling us that this is a top leave and travel benefit, and nearly 3 in 10 actually ranking it first in terms of the #1 leave and travel benefit. I might just throw to Danny here. Danny, what trends have you seen on the ground from employers in terms of rosters and travel on company time, particularly during COVID, and how that has changed things?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. So Danny Tarmody from the Resources Hub. Obviously, we've seen a huge impact. A lot of companies have moved from a 2 and 1 to a 4 and 2. We've also seen companies move from an 8 and 6 to a 2 and 2. And I think that was generally around the need for the 14 days of isolation in case there were any COVID incidents up on site. It's across the board for both mining clients and contract service clients. And I think that also needs to be at the forefront of companies, because not all of us work for mining companies per se, but we're also involved in contract services companies that support the mining industry. So there has also been a shift for some companies to relocate their eastern states employees and families to WA for continuity of employment for the worker, and also obviously for production. So that's been a bit of a shift. And residential employment has always been, I suppose, since FIFO was introduced many years ago, in my experience, has been one of those difficult areas to ensure that people would want to move and relocate to residential remote towns. And we did also grab a bit of a snapshot from those workers and their partners as well. So for people that were coming over from the eastern states and the companies that had the foresight to actually make that decision and make it fairly rapidly, have managed to maintain a lot of their employees. And clearly with the borders being closed, that's had a dramatic effect on the talent pool that we not only have in WA at the moment to be able to resource the current needs that we have, but obviously also, you know, the need for those eastern staters to remain in employment as well. Travelling on company time has always been a nice to have, and I know that during the downturn we weren't as fortunate or many candidates and employees weren't as fortunate to have that as an option, and that was purely during the downtime. But I think companies have realised the importance of what that brings for the retention of employees coming out of this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danny. So moving on to the next theme from the research, the next thing we wanted to discuss was the fact that improving on-site experience isn't necessarily about luxury and grand gestures. And I think this is important because there's a risk that companies are actually spending money in areas that might not get the best bang for their buck in terms of what the actual workforce needs are for really making that on-site experience better. So I'll just take you through some of the findings with regards to the on-site experience. So firstly, when we look at the importance of on-site accommodation, I think it's really important to point out that the things that came through loud and clear for us were really that workers just want a good night's sleep. That is really, you know, the key thing for them in terms of their on-site accommodation. They're looking for things like soundproofing, a comfortable bed, blackout curtains. So not really unreasonable requests when you consider the long shifts that these people are working, and they need to be able to recover quickly for the next shift coming up. So, you know, big availability gaps that we're seeing there in fairly simple things that would actually make a big difference to the on-site accommodation that companies could be looking to introduce. So soundproofing, for example, is likely to be far less expensive than some of those bigger ticket things that we've seen introduced by companies like virtual reality gaming and golf driving ranges and things that are quite large, significant investments, where actually the workforce is telling us that, you know, things that make their on-site accommodation feel more like a home away from home is really going to make the biggest impact for them in terms of what's important. We also looked at when people are choosing between employers specifically offering FIFO roles, what impact the on-site accommodation and facilities would have, just to validate, I guess, the importance of the various benefits within those areas. And what we did find is that for more than 7 in 10, the accommodation and the facilities would have a strong impact on their decision. So just kind of lend some weight around why it's important to get these aspects right and to really make sure that what you're offering does align with what the workforce is saying is most important. So in terms of the facilities available on site, we did find encouragingly that employers are getting the basics right. So we found strong, you know, it was very common for the workforce to tell us that they had access to things like a shop, a communal laundry and a medical centre or a doctor. But perhaps companies are focusing a little bit too much on those extras when it comes to amenities. So for example, we found that while the wet mess and the gym were very prevalent in terms of being made available to around 9 in 10 of the respondents, we actually found that this is less important to them. So only around 2 in 5 telling us that it's important that there's a wet mess on site, and around half a gym, and even fewer, around 2 in 5, a pool. So just something to bear in mind in terms of, you know, whether your workforce is actually going to benefit these bigger items, or whether you might, as I say, get more bang for your buck focusing on some of the accommodation aspects and some of those more basic amenities. I might throw to you here, Anthony. I guess what would you recommend companies do to make sure that they're, I guess, focusing on the right things when they're communicating benefits to current and prospective employees?
Yeah, well, look, from a communications perspective, it's quite an interesting challenge to have, because it's far easier to communicate new things or shiny new things than it is to communicate the basics. And making yourself stand out on the basics is obviously far harder. So, you know, it is obviously easier to communicate about a new sort of virtual driving range than it is about curtains or soundproofing or having a good bed. But if it turns out that that's what really matters to employees, and that is absolutely what companies need to be communicating about. They just need to find the right medium for doing it. So from my perspective, I think if I was sitting internally looking at this, the first thing I'd be doing is actually cross-checking this data with my own employee group. I'd be potentially doing that using an external agency, because a lot of these things don't actually get communicated back to HR departments. They're the gossip in the mess. They're the word of mouth out in the community about whether you do get a decent night's sleep somewhere or not. So I'd cross-check the data. And then if what people really want to know about is the basics, you need to find a way of communicating the basics. And there are lots of ways of doing it. And I'll touch on some of them probably at the end in the Q&A session. But humour in particular, and a bit of levity, I think is quite important when you're working around things like getting a good night's sleep. It's a serious subject matter, but you can certainly do it in creative ways.
Excellent. Thank you. Look forward to hearing more about that towards the end. So the next theme that we've got to discuss today is the fact that when you're thinking about benefits and rewarding your staff, you really need to look beyond the day-to-day. And so what we looked at here is, again, that partner and family perspective. And I think what came through very strongly through this research is the need to consider not just the worker who you're actually employing, but what comes with that. So the support that you're actually offering to the families, or to where there's children involved and partners involved, beyond the day-to-day that will actually support them in their role. So we'll drill into that a bit further now, and particularly from the actual worker perspective, the importance of career progression. So we had a hypothesis that people with a partner would involve their partner in that decision making when it comes to choosing an employer and choosing a working arrangement, but we wanted to test and validate that. So we did manage to confirm that for around 3 in 5 people, that their partner, this is people that have a partner, say that that partner has an influence over their working arrangements and employment choices. So again, you know, important to consider how you can get that partner and the family on board in terms of, from an acquisition perspective, getting that new employee or worker joining your company. We also looked at what challenges the different working arrangements create when we're talking about particularly FIFO and residential workforces. And we found that the number one challenge, which is probably not surprising to people listening, was missing out on family events, milestones and celebrations. So nearly 3/4 of people said that that was a challenge that they faced in their current working arrangement as a FIFO or a residential worker. Around half felt disconnected from their partner and or their children. And one of the interesting things there is we actually found that that was more prevalent among residential workers than it was FIFO, which you may not expect because the FIFO worker is the one with the many kilometres distance between them. But actually it was the residential workers that telling us more commonly that this was a challenge that they face. And likewise for around 2 in 5, difficulties for their partner and or children was a challenge. And again, you know, we did hear about this with regards to the residential perspective as well, which I'll touch on in a moment. So in terms of whether these challenges are actually sufficient to make people consider leaving their job, we did find that for around 1/3 of people facing these challenges, they said they were actively looking for a different job. And a further 1 in 10 said they would start to look for a different job within 12 months. So again, you know, really important from a retention perspective that you're considering not just the worker, but what you're actually offering in terms of broader support to that family and to that partner as part of that package. When we looked at which challenges were the most likely to be driving them to make that decision to leave, again, it was really missing out on family events that came through as the most common aspect there. One of the really interesting things to us, at least when we were analysing the data, was this huge disconnect seemingly between perception and reality when it comes to how workers think that their partner perceives their working arrangements and what the partner's experience actually is. So you can see on this slide here that we found that around a third of workers believe their partners are miserable or unhappy about their current working arrangements, but less than 1 in 7 partners actually told us that they were miserable or unhappy. So this potentially, begs the question over whether workers that are working in FIFO or residential arrangements are perhaps unnecessarily carrying a bit of a mental burden that wouldn't be there if they were able to have those conversations with their partners, and whether that's facilitated through the onboarding arrangement. I'm not sure what that looks like, but if you can find a way to bridge that gap, you could actually find that it's going to increase your worker satisfaction because they're not carrying that guilt, and it's going to potentially alleviate some of that stress that they might be feeling about the burden of their arrangements on their family. Danny, you have experience as a partner of someone who's worked FIFO for a long time. Do you think this is a common challenge for FIFO families?
I do. As somebody who also lived residential, I know what that takes. I lived in the Pilbara for 14 years and I was FIFO before my husband went FIFO. I think there's common communication issues in a lot of industries, not just obviously mining, so defence when people are working away for long periods of time. But I also think that we're really fortunate in this day and age that partners in particular and also workers have some support mechanisms for them when they are feeling a little bit stressed. We've got Facebook groups and forums, and there's also a lot of companies out there whose core focus is to assist with FIFO families and support them during this period, because it can, be quite stressful. As we know, communication is critical to any healthy relationship, and it's really interesting, I think, with the data that was received around the partners' perspective as to how they felt in particular. So yeah, I do think that there can be more done for mining companies and contract services companies moving forward, and this clearly states that.
Fantastic, thank you. We also found some really interesting insights with regards to career progression. So when we look at these as part of those broader non-financial benefits, what really came through is that people are placing a lot of importance on things like career advancement pathways, professional development and training, and mentoring and coaching. Yet they don't feel like they're actually getting access to this through their workplace. So you can see here that 3/4 of people told us that clear career pathways was an important non-financial benefit, yet only 1 in 5 say that they're actually getting access to that. So a huge availability gap there. And likewise, professional development and training, 3/4 saying it's important, only a third being provided this. And arguably, we know that it sort of costs a lot more to hire someone new than it does to retain your staff. So investing in these things can have benefits from a churn perspective, but also in terms of just giving back to your workers and making sure that they feel valued for the sacrifices that they're making in the choices that they've made around their work life. So a real gap there. And I was interested to know, I guess, Danny, again, whether you had any perspectives on, why aren't companies investing more in their workforce? Have you seen a trend away from that, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw a huge trend away from companies providing training and development during the downturn, and a lot of candidates took it upon themselves to actually invest in their own career pathways and spend the money to upskill. And I think, as things started to sort of become normal again, definitely not boom time, but as we started to see some more activity around employment, companies realise that training and development is really, really important. The interesting thing here is the career advancement pathways, because there have been, obviously in the industry, there's a lot of people that they may start off, my husband might be one of them, but they may start off in one particular area and then they move into a completely different area but still remain in the industry. And I think from a company point of view, it's really important to benchmark their employees to see what it is that they're actually interested in order for retention of a workforce moving forward. So this is absolutely no surprise to me. And we hear it every week from candidates who say, look, I might get paid really well and I might have a perfect roster and they FIFO me from the eastern states, but I can't see that my career is going to move upwards, and therefore I need a new opportunity and a new challenge.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, definitely a big challenge for companies, and we found that in terms of the top 3 non-financial benefits, we found again that professional development and training for current workers, around 2 in 5, putting this as one of their top 3 non-financial benefits, and likewise for former workers slightly lower, or just under a third, saying that this was one of their top 3. And you can see that for around 1 in 10 current workers, or just slightly higher, professional development and training and clear career pathways do rank as their number 1 non-financial benefit. So something that's really important, I think, to get right. Just to wrap up, I guess, in terms of the key takeaways that we've talked about today, this is really about helping you understand the decision making of workers and what's influencing your ability to attract and retain them. So just to sum up some of the key things that came through from the research, the first one is around treating that worker as part of a family unit. So the supportive, family-friendly policies that do take into account not just the needs of the workers, but their families as well, particularly for those in FIFO and residential roles, we found was really important for helping them really weigh up and balance the emotional and social costs that comes with working in those types of arrangements against that financial payoff for them and their families. In terms of living and accommodation, as we discussed, it's not necessarily about big ticket items or luxury. It's really about focusing on those creature comforts, the things that makes their on-site experience more like home, and the things that really are conducive to getting a good night's sleep, because that's really ranking very highly on their priority list. From a PD and career advancement perspective, as we've just discussed, and as Danny mentioned, these are really essential to retention. We are finding strong demand from the workforce for this. And not only is this going to actually help reduce churn and reduce those recruitment and retention costs, it's also going to have the benefit of actually upskilling your workforce, which obviously has long-term benefits for your company as well. And then finally, the point that we started with, which was the fact that, we spend a lot of time focusing on salary, but while that is really obviously critical for this sector and many other sectors, many workers actually really lack an understanding of what other benefits are available to them, and even just running some sort of internal communications campaign, or once you've actually understood what benefits are most important, to make sure that they're actually aware those exist is really important, and could have quite a significant uplift for you in terms of employee satisfaction and engagement. So before we move on to the panel discussion, where we'll be discussing some of the sort of key issues that have arisen from the research, if you are interested to know more, as I said, this is really just scratching the surface. The full report does provide a really comprehensive view of what is most important to workers and where you should be really focusing your attention. So you can go on and purchase the full report from the same website that you used to register for this webinar. So it's available for purchase for $900 ex GST. You can purchase it directly through your credit card on the website, or feel free to contact us to arrange a copy.